The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty construction site in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. Harold "Hank" Morrison, 67, stood at the edge of what would become the foundation of his dream home, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The year was 2018, and after 43 years of working construction, from framing houses in Detroit's booming suburbs to installing drywall in California's sprawling developments, he was finally building something for himself. "You sure about this location, Dad?" his son Michael had asked during their last conversation, skepticism evident in his voice through the crackling phone connection. "It's pretty far from everything." Hank had chosen this particular lot on the outskirts of Scottsdale deliberately. 2.5 acres of desert land, bordered by ancient saguaro cacti and offering an unobstructed view of the McDowell Mountains. It wasn't close to shopping centers or his old neighborhood, but that was exactly the point. After losing his wife Eleanor to cancer 3 years prior, he needed space to breathe, to remember who he was beyond the hospital corridors and prescription schedules that had defined his final years with her. The autumn air carried the scent of creosote and the distant sound of traffic from the 101 freeway. Hank pulled the blueprints from his weathered leather satchel, the same one Eleanor had given him for their 20th anniversary. The house he designed was modest by Scottsdale standards, 2,400 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, with a spacious kitchen that opened to a great room featuring floor-to-ceiling windows facing the mountains. What made it special were the details only someone with his experience would think to include: extra-wide hallways for Eleanor's wheelchair that she'd never need now, a workshop with proper ventilation and electrical for his woodworking, and a covered patio designed to catch the morning sun and avoid the brutal afternoon heat. "Morning, Hank." The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, a concrete specialist he'd worked with on several projects over the years. Miguel was one of the few contractors Hank trusted completely, a man whose attention to detail matched his own. "Morning, Miguel. Ready to pour some foundation?" Miguel nodded, gesturing toward the concrete truck rumbling up the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that caught the morning light. "Been looking forward to this one. Not often we get to build something for family, you know?" That word, family, still felt strange to Hank. His relationship with his children had grown complicated over the years. Michael, 41, lived in Seattle with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage daughters. He'd followed a path Hank never quite understood: corporate consulting, constant travel, a life measured in PowerPoint presentations and quarterly reports. Their conversations had become increasingly stilted, filled with long pauses and careful politeness. His daughter Sarah, 38, lived closer, just 40 minutes away in Tempe, but the physical proximity somehow made their emotional distance more pronounced. She'd married young to escape what she called the chaos of Hank's household. Though he'd never understood what she meant, he and Eleanor had provided stability, had worked every day to give their children opportunities they'd never had. The concrete truck positioned itself carefully, and Hank watched as Miguel's crew began the pour. This was the moment he'd been planning for months, the literal foundation of his new life. He'd sold the house in Glendale, where he and Eleanor had raised the kids, downsized his possessions to what could fit in a storage unit, and moved into a small apartment while construction began. Every dollar of the house sale, combined with his modest savings and Eleanor's life insurance, was going into this project. "You planning to do much of the work yourself?" asked Tony Reeves, the electrician scheduled to begin rough-in work the following week. Tony was younger than Hank, maybe 55, but he'd earned respect through years of meticulous work and fair dealing. "Much as I can," Hank replied, watching the concrete flow into the forms he'd spent 2 days making perfectly level. "Still got it in me, I think." It wasn't entirely true. The arthritis in his hands had worsened significantly over the past year, and his knees ached after long days on his feet. But this house represented more than just a place to live. It was proof that Harold Morrison still had purpose, that he could create something meaningful with his own hands, even as everything else in his life seemed to be slipping away. The morning progressed with the rhythmic efficiency of experienced professionals. Miguel's crew smoothed and leveled the concrete, while Hank double-checked measurements and alignment. By noon, the foundation was complete, and the workers gathered under the shade of a large Palo Verde tree for lunch. "So, what's the timeline looking like?" Miguel asked, unwrapping a sandwich his wife had packed. "Framing starts Monday," Hank said, consulting the detailed schedule he'd created. "Roofing should be done before the real heat hits in May. I'm hoping to move in by Christmas." The Christmas felt impossibly far away, 9 months of work stretching ahead, but Hank had learned patience during Eleanor's long illness. Some things couldn't be rushed, and the good things were worth waiting for. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How's the construction going, Dad? Hope you're not overdoing it." The message was typical, caring but distant, checking a box rather than opening a conversation. He typed back, "Foundation poured today. Looking good." He waited for a response that didn't come. The afternoon heat began to build as the crew packed up their tools. Hank stood alone on his property, looking at the rectangular outline of concrete that would anchor his future. The desert stretched out in all directions, punctuated by the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti that had stood sentinel here for over a century. Some of them showed bullet holes from target practice by trespassers over the years, but they continued to grow, to bloom, to endure. That evening, Hank returned to his temporary apartment, a sterile one-bedroom unit in a complex filled with young professionals and retirees, downsizing from larger homes. The walls were beige, the carpet a forgettable brown, and the only personal touch was a framed photo of Eleanor on the small dining table. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-sentence during their anniversary dinner 5 years ago, before the diagnosis, before everything changed. He opened his laptop and updated the construction blog he'd started, partly to document the process and partly to feel less alone in the endeavor. He wasn't a natural writer, but he tried to capture the day's progress. Foundation is in. Strange how something so fundamental can feel so significant. Miguel's crew did beautiful work, level and square, just like it should be. Started thinking about Eleanor today, how she would have loved seeing this come together. She always said I worked better when I was building something, rather than just fixing what other people had broken. The blog had 17 followers, mostly other retirees he'd met through construction forums. It wasn't much, but it felt like connection in a life that had become increasingly solitary. Before bed, he reviewed the next day's tasks: final grading around the foundation, delivery of framing lumber, and a meeting with his general contractor's license renewal officer, a bureaucratic necessity that reminded him how much the industry had changed since he'd started working construction in 1975. As he drifted off to sleep, Hank allowed himself to imagine the completed house, morning coffee on the covered patio, the workshop filled with his tools and current projects, maybe even having the grandkids visit during summer break. It was a modest dream, but it was his own, built on a foundation that would last long after he was gone. Outside his apartment window, the city lights of Phoenix spread across the valley like a glittering constellation, each light representing someone else's version of home, someone else's foundation for building a life. Tomorrow, he would continue building his own. 6 months had passed since the foundation pour, and the skeletal frame of Hank's house now stood against the Arizona sky like a promise beginning to take shape. The desert heat of late April was already formidable, with temperatures reaching the mid-90s by noon, but the work continued. Hank had adapted his schedule to the climate, starting before dawn and calling it quits by early afternoon, when the sun turned the job site into an oven. "Looking good, Mr. Morrison," called out David Chen, a young framer who'd impressed Hank with his precision and work ethic. At 28, David reminded Hank of himself at that age, eager to prove himself, willing to put in extra hours to get things right. "The great room is going to have some serious presence when it's finished." Hank nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana that had seen better days. The frame did look good, walls rising true and square, roof trusses perfectly aligned, everything according to the plans he'd refined over countless evenings. But the satisfaction he'd expected to feel was complicated by growing tensions that had nothing to do with construction tolerances or building codes. The first sign of trouble had come 3 weeks earlier, when Sarah made one of her infrequent visits to the job site. She'd arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, stepping carefully through the construction debris in her designer shoes and looking around with an expression Hank couldn't quite read. "Dad, this is really quite impressive," she'd said, though her tone suggested surprise rather than admiration. "I had no idea you were building something this substantial." 2,400 square feet isn't that big," Hank had replied, sensing criticism beneath her words. "Your house in Tempe is bigger than this." "It's not about the size." Sarah had walked through the framed rooms, her real estate agent's eye cataloguing details. "It's about the location, the investment." "Dad, do you realize how much equity you've tied up in this property? What if something happens to your health? What if you can't maintain a place like this?" The conversation had continued in that vein for another hour, Sarah expressing concerns about his decision-making, his isolation, his refusal to consider more practical alternatives like a senior living community. Hank had listened politely, but her words felt like judgments on choices he'd made deliberately and carefully. Now, standing in what would become his kitchen, Hank tried to focus on the immediate task at hand, reviewing the electrical rough-in with Tony Reeves. The electrician was running wire through the studs, his movements efficient and practiced. "You want the range outlet here?" Tony asked, pointing to a spot behind where the island would be installed. "That's right, and make sure there's a dedicated circuit for the microwave." Hank had learned from years of working in other people's houses. Kitchens needed more electrical capacity than most people anticipated. "You got it. How about the workshop? You still want that 240 outlet for the table saw?" The workshop had become one of Hank's favorite parts of the design, a 12 by 16 space attached to the garage with proper ventilation, abundant electrical outlets, and built-in storage for his tools. He'd spent 43 years working with other people's tools on other people's projects. This would be his space, designed exactly for how he liked to work. Definitely, and add another 110 circuit while you're at it. Never can have too many outlets. His phone rang as Tony moved to the next room. The caller ID showed Michael's number. Unusual for a weekday afternoon. Michael rarely called unless something was wrong. "Hey, Mike. What's going on?" "Dad, I've been talking to Sarah." Michael's voice carried the careful tone he used for difficult conversations. "She's concerned about some things, and honestly, so am I." Hank stepped outside the framed house, seeking privacy from the workers. "What kind of concerns?" "Well, for starters, the amount of money you're spending on this project. Sarah says you've put everything into it. The house sale, Mom's insurance, your savings. What happens if construction costs overrun? What happens if you need medical care?" "The budget is solid, Mike. I've been doing this kind of work my whole life. I know what things cost." "That's not really the point, Dad. The point is that you're almost 70 years old, living alone in the middle of nowhere with no support system. Sarah drove out there last week. She says it's 20 minutes to the nearest grocery store." Hank felt his jaw tighten. I chose this location deliberately. I like the space, the quiet, and I'm 67, not 90. I know, but Dad, we're worried about you. This whole project feels like, I don't know, like you're trying to prove something instead of making practical decisions for your future. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Hank was trying to prove something, that he was still capable, still relevant, still had something to contribute. But he was also building a home, creating a space where he could live on his own terms. Look, Mike, I appreciate your concern, but this is my life. I'm not asking for your money or your help. I'm building a house where I want to live. That's just it, Dad. Maybe you should be asking for help. Maybe you should be considering what happens 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Sarah found some really nice assisted living places. I'm not moving into assisted living. The words came out sharper than Hank intended. I can take care of myself. I've been taking care of myself just fine. There was a long pause. When Michael spoke again, his voice was gentler but no less determined. Dad, we're not trying to control your life. We're trying to look out for you. Mom would have wanted us to look out for you. The mention of Eleanor felt like a low blow, though Hank knew Michael hadn't meant it that way. Eleanor would have supported this project, would have understood his need to create something lasting. She'd always encouraged his craftsmanship, had been proud of his skill and attention to detail. I have to get back to work, Hank said. The electrician is waiting for me. Okay, but Dad, can we talk about this more seriously soon? Maybe you could come up to Seattle for a visit, see the girls. They ask about Grandpa all the time. After ending the call, Hank stood in the desert heat, looking at the house taking shape around him. The frame cast crisp shadows on the concrete slab, and he could envision the finished rooms, the kitchen where he'd prepare simple meals, the living room where he'd read in the evenings, the workshop where he'd build furniture for the grandchildren he rarely saw. Everything okay, Mr. Morrison? David Chen approached carefully, clearly having sensed the tension in Hank's voice during the phone call. Fine, just family stuff. Hank managed a smile. How's the framing coming along? Really good. We should have the roof trusses set by Friday. You want to walk through and check our work? For the next hour, Hank lost himself in the familiar rhythm of construction inspection, checking for plumb walls, square corners, proper spacing between studs. This was work he understood, problems he could solve. The frame was solid, built to last for generations. As the afternoon crew wrapped up their work, Hank remained on the job site, sitting on a stack of lumber and watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. The desert had a particular quality of light in the late afternoon, golden and warm, softening the harsh edges of the landscape. This was why he'd chosen this location, this sense of space and permanence. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Dad, Mike told me you two talked. I know we're being pushy, but it's because we love you. Can we take you to dinner this weekend, just to talk? Hank stared at the message for a long time before responding. Sure, but we eat where I want to go. He chose a small Mexican restaurant in Scottsdale that he and Eleanor had discovered years ago, before the area became trendy and expensive. The food was authentic, the atmosphere unpretentious, and the owner still remembered Eleanor's preference for extra salsa verde. That evening, in his temporary apartment, Hank updated his construction blog. Framing is nearly complete. The house is starting to look like a house instead of just an idea. Had some difficult conversations with the kids today. They're worried about me living out here alone, worried about the money I'm spending, worried about my future. I understand their concerns, but I also understand something they don't. Sometimes you have to build your own foundation, literally and figuratively. This house isn't just about having a place to live. It's about having a place that's mine, built my way, according to my own plans. He paused, considering whether to share more personal details, then continued. Eleanor and I never got to build our dream house. We were always too busy, too focused on practical concerns, too worried about the kids' college funds or unexpected expenses. Now, I have the chance to build something exactly the way I want it, and I'm not going to let fear, mine or anyone else's, stop me. The frame is solid, the foundation is strong. Whatever comes next, this house will endure. Before bed, he stood on his apartment balcony, looking east toward his property. Even in the darkness, he could picture the frame standing against the sky, a promise taking shape one board at a time. Tomorrow, the roof trusses would arrive. In a few more weeks, he'd have walls and a roof, protection from the elements and privacy from the world. It was a good feeling. Despite everything else, he was building something that would last. October in Phoenix brought the first hint of relief from the summer's brutal heat, with daytime temperatures dropping into the comfortable 80s. Hank's house had progressed dramatically over the past few months. The roof was complete, exterior walls were up and stucco finished in a warm desert beige, and the interior was taking shape with drywall, tile, and the careful installation of fixtures he'd chosen personally. Standing in what would be his kitchen, admiring the quartz countertops that had been installed the previous week, Hank felt a deep satisfaction that almost compensated for the growing tension with his children. The kitchen was exactly as he'd envisioned it. Clean lines, practical layout, and a large window that framed the McDowell Mountains perfectly. "Mr. Morrison?" The voice belonged to Jessica Martinez, his real estate attorney. She'd driven out from Scottsdale for what she'd described as an urgent matter that couldn't be discussed over the phone. "Do you have a few minutes to talk privately?" Something in her tone set off alarm bells. Jessica was normally relaxed and confident, but today she seemed nervous, almost apologetic. They walked to the covered patio, where two folding chairs provided the only seating on the property. "What's going on, Jessica?" She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I received some paperwork yesterday that I think you need to see. It's a petition for guardianship filed by your children." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. He reached for the papers with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. The legal language was dense and formal, but the intent was clear. Michael and Sarah Morrison were requesting that the court declare their father incompetent to manage his own affairs and appoint them as his legal guardians. "This can't be right," Hank said, scanning the document. They don't have grounds for this." "I'm afraid they do have legal standing to file the petition," Jessica said gently. "The question is whether they can prove their case. They're alleging several things: social isolation, poor judgment regarding financial decisions, and what they call obsessive behavior related to this construction project." Hank read through the specific allegations, his anger building with each line. They claimed he was living in squalor in his temporary apartment, that he'd squandered his life savings on an impractical vanity project, and that he was increasingly isolated from family and friends, showing signs of depression and possible cognitive decline. "This is insane," he said, his voice tight with fury. "I'm building a house, not losing my mind. I know it seems outrageous, but we need to take this seriously. They've apparently been documenting their concerns for months. Phone calls, visits, conversations with neighbors at your old house. They even have statements from some of your former co-workers expressing worry about your mental state." The betrayal cut deep. Hank thought about the careful way Michael and Sarah had been approaching him lately, their questions about his plans and finances that he'd attributed to normal family concern. They'd been building a case against him, gathering evidence to support their claim that he was no longer capable of making his own decisions. What happens now? "There'll be a hearing in 3 weeks. You'll need to appear before a judge and demonstrate that you're competent to manage your own affairs. I'll represent you, of course, but we need to prepare carefully. They're going to present evidence that your decision-making has become impaired. That evening, Hank sat alone in his sparse apartment, staring at the legal papers spread across his small dining table. The petition painted a picture of a confused, declining old man making irrational choices out of grief and stubbornness. It was a narrative that transformed his greatest accomplishment, building his dream house, into evidence of mental incompetence. His phone rang. Sarah's number. "Dad, I know you've probably heard from your lawyer by now." "You mean you know, because you're the one who filed papers to have me declared incompetent?" Hank's voice was ice-cold. "Dad, please listen. We didn't want it to come to this, but you're not thinking clearly. You've isolated yourself, you're living in that awful apartment, and you're pouring every penny you have into a house that's too big and too remote for someone your age. So you decided to take away my rights as an adult human being? We're trying to protect you." Sarah's voice rose with emotion. "Mum's been gone for 3 years, and instead of grieving properly, you've thrown yourself into this obsessive project. You won't consider any alternatives, you won't listen to reason, and you're setting yourself up for financial and physical catastrophe. The house is nearly finished, Sarah. I'm 2 months away from moving in." "How is that a catastrophe? Because what happens when you can't climb the stairs anymore? What happens when you fall and there's no one around for miles? What happens when you run out of money for maintenance and repairs?" Hank had considered all these scenarios, had planned for them as carefully as he'd planned the house itself. But he could hear in Sarah's voice that she'd already decided he was incapable of rational planning. "I suppose you have it all figured out," he said. "Where I should live, how I should spend my money, what I should do with the rest of my life. There's a beautiful community in Ahwatukee, independent living with support services available. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be people around, activities, medical care available. You could still do your woodworking in their craft room." The image she painted, a sterile apartment in a managed community, supervised activities, his tools relegated to a shared craft room, filled Hank with despair. It was the opposite of everything he was trying to build. "And what happens to my house?" There was a pause. "We'd sell it, of course. The equity would more than cover your living expenses for years." "So you want to take the house I built with my own hands and sell it to strangers?" "Dad, it's just a house. It's not worth destroying your life over." But it wasn't just a house to Hank. It was proof that he still had something to offer, that his hands could still create something lasting and beautiful. It was the place where he planned to spend his remaining years on his own terms, surrounded by work he'd done himself. The conversation ended badly, with harsh words and hurt feelings on both sides. Hank spent the rest of the evening walking through his nearly completed house, using a flashlight to illuminate the rooms that would soon be his home. The hardwood floors gleamed under the LED beam, the custom cabinets fit perfectly, and the whole structure felt solid and permanent. In the master bedroom, he stood where his bed would go and looked out the window toward the mountains. Eleanor would have loved this view, would have understood why he needed to build this place. She'd always supported his need to create things with his hands, had encouraged him to take risks and follow his instincts. The next morning, Hank called a meeting with his attorney to discuss strategy for the competency hearing. They sat in Jessica's downtown office, surrounded by law books and legal briefs. "The good news is that the burden of proof is on them," Jessica explained. "They have to convince a judge that you're incompetent. The bad news is that they seem to have done their homework." She showed him copies of the evidence his children planned to present, photographs of his sparse apartment, financial records showing the depletion of his savings account, statements from neighbors and co-workers expressing concern about his behavior. They even have testimony from your former family doctor, who says you've missed several routine appointments and haven't established care with a new physician since moving to your temporary apartment. I've been busy with construction, and I feel fine. I believe you, but we need to demonstrate your competence clearly and systematically. I want to arrange for an independent psychological evaluation, and we should document your involvement in the construction project. Show that you've been making complex decisions effectively and managing contractors and budgets successfully. Over the next 2 weeks, Hank submitted to a battery of psychological tests and cognitive assessments. The psychologist, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, was thorough and professional, testing his memory, decision-making ability, and mental state. She also visited the construction site and interviewed several of the contractors who'd worked on the project. "Your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for your age," she told him after completing her evaluation. "You show no signs of dementia or significant depression. Your decision to build this house appears to be well-reasoned and carefully planned." But Hank knew that expert testimony might not be enough. The legal system often erred on the side of caution when it came to elderly individuals, especially when family members raised concerns about safety and welfare. 3 days before the hearing, Hank made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Michael and Sarah and asked them to meet him at the house. They arrived together on a Saturday afternoon, both looking uncomfortable and defensive. Sarah wore a business suit despite the weekend, as if armor against the conversation to come. Michael kept checking his phone, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "I want to show you something," Hank said simply. For the next hour, he led them through every room of the house, explaining the design decisions, the quality of construction, the thought that had gone into every detail. He showed them the master bedroom with its view of the mountains, the kitchen with its practical layout and high-end appliances, the workshop where he planned to build furniture for his grandchildren. "This isn't the project of a man who's lost his mind," he said finally. "This is the work of someone who knows exactly what he wants and has the skills to make it happen." Sarah was quiet during the tour, but he could see her real estate agent's eye cataloguing the quality of finishes and attention to detail. Michael seemed more interested in the technical aspects, the electrical systems, the solar panel installation, the energy-efficient design. "Dad, it's beautiful," Sarah said finally. "I had no idea. You had no idea because you decided I was incompetent before you bothered to really look at what I was doing." They stood on the covered patio, looking out at the desert landscape that would be Hank's daily view. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of misunderstanding and assumptions. "We're still going forward with the hearing," Michael said finally. "This doesn't change our concerns about your isolation and what happens as you get older." "I know," Hank said, "but I wanted you to see what you're trying to take away from me." As they drove away, Hank remained on his patio, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. In 3 days, he would sit before a judge and defend his right to live in the house he'd built with his own hands. The outcome would determine not just where he lived, but whether he retained the basic dignity of making his own choices about his own life. The house stood around him, solid and complete, waiting for its first resident. Whatever happened in court, Hank knew he'd created something lasting and beautiful. The question was whether he'd be allowed to enjoy it. The Maricopa County Courthouse buzzed with the usual morning activity. Attorneys consulting with clients, families waiting nervously for hearings, the shuffle of paperwork and legal procedures that determined people's fates. Hank Morrison sat in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, wearing his best suit and trying to project the confidence he didn't entirely feel. Jessica Martinez sat beside him, reviewing her notes one final time. "Remember, this isn't about proving you're perfect," she said quietly. "It's about proving you're competent to make your own decisions, even if others disagree with those decisions." Across the hallway, Michael and Sarah sat with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who specialized in elder law. They avoided eye contact with Hank, which somehow hurt more than the legal proceedings themselves. "Morrison guardianship case," called the bailiff. "All parties to courtroom 3B. Judge Patricia Williamson was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every possible family drama play out in her courtroom. She reviewed the files briefly before looking up at the assembled parties. "This is a petition for guardianship filed by Michael and Sarah Morrison concerning their father, Harold Morrison. The petitioners allege that Mr. Morrison is no longer competent to manage his personal and financial affairs. Mr. Morrison contests this petition. Let's proceed." The next 2 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of evidence and testimony. Michael and Sarah's attorney presented their case methodically. Photographs of Hank's sparse temporary apartment, financial records showing the depletion of his savings, testimony from his former neighbors expressing concern about his behavior since Eleanor's death. Dr. Robert Chen, a geriatrician who had never actually examined Hank, testified about the common signs of cognitive decline in elderly individuals and the risks of social isolation. "While I cannot diagnose Mr. Morrison specifically," he said, "the pattern of behavior described by his children, social withdrawal, obsessive focus on a single project, resistance to reasonable advice, could indicate developing dementia or depression." Sarah took the stand next, her voice steady but emotional. "My father has completely isolated himself since our mother died. He sold the family home where we grew up, moved into a depressing apartment, and poured every penny into this construction project in the middle of nowhere. When we try to discuss practical concerns, what happens if he gets sick, what happens as he ages, he becomes angry and defensive. This isn't the rational man who raised us." Michael's testimony echoed similar themes. "Dad used to be so social, so engaged with the world. Now he lives alone, doesn't maintain friendships, and has become obsessed with this house to the exclusion of everything else. We're not trying to control his life, we're trying to save it." When it was Jessica's turn to present Hank's defense, she began with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the psychologist who had evaluated him. Dr. Hernandez was thorough and compelling, describing the battery of cognitive tests she'd administered and their results. "Mr. Morrison shows no signs of dementia or significant cognitive impairment," she testified. "His memory is excellent, his decision-making process is logical and well-reasoned, and his mood, while understandably affected by grief over his wife's death, does not meet criteria for clinical depression. The construction project he's undertaken demonstrates complex planning abilities, financial management skills, and sustained attention to detail." And Miguel Santos, the concrete contractor, testified about Hank's competence and professionalism throughout the construction process. "Mr. Morrison knows more about building than most people I work with," he said. "Every decision he made was smart. Every detail was thought through. This isn't the work of someone who's confused or incompetent." David Chen, the young framer, provided similar testimony about Hank's expertise and clear thinking. Tony Reeves, the electrician, described how Hank had caught several potential problems and suggested improvements that demonstrated his technical knowledge and attention to safety. But the most powerful testimony came from Hank himself. Jessica had coached him to be clear and direct, to avoid the defensiveness that had characterized his interactions with his children. "Your Honor," he said, standing at the witness podium, "I'm not claiming to be perfect or immune to the effects of aging. But I am claiming the right to make my own decisions about how to live my remaining years. The house I've built represents careful planning, sound financial management, and the application of skills I've developed over 43 years in construction." He pulled out a thick folder of documents. These are the construction plans, permits, inspection reports and financial records for the project. Every decision was deliberate, every expense was budgeted, every detail was planned. This isn't the work of someone who's lost his capacity for rational thought. Hank described his daily routine, his ongoing relationships with contractors and neighbors, his plans for maintaining the house and managing his finances. He acknowledged his grief over Eleanor's death, but explained how the construction project had helped him process that loss while creating something positive. "My children are concerned about my isolation," he said, "but I'm not isolated by choice. I'm building a life that makes sense for who I am now, not who I was when I was married or when my children were young. The house is designed for my current needs and anticipated future needs. It's not a fantasy. It's a practical solution to the question of how to age with dignity and independence." Judge Williamson asked several pointed questions about his health, his financial situation, and his plans for emergencies or medical needs. Hank's answers were detailed and thoughtful, demonstrating that he'd considered these challenges carefully. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said finally, "your children clearly love you and are concerned for your welfare. How do you respond to their fears about your isolation and safety? I understand their concerns, Your Honor, and I appreciate that they come from love. But their solution, moving me into managed care and selling the house I built, would destroy everything I've worked for. I'm asking for the right to succeed or fail on my own terms, in a place I've created with my own hands." After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Williamson recessed for deliberation. The wait felt interminable. Hank sat in the hallway, watching his children confer with their attorney, wondering if these legal proceedings would permanently damage what remained of their relationship. When court reconvened, Judge Williamson's expression was thoughtful but decisive. "This court has reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this guardianship petition," she began. "While I appreciate the genuine concern expressed by the petitioners for their father's welfare, I find insufficient evidence to support a finding of incompetence." Hank felt his heart pounding as she continued. "Mr. Harold Morrison has demonstrated through both testimony and documentary evidence that he retains the cognitive capacity to make reasoned decisions about his personal and financial affairs. The construction project that forms the basis of much of the petitioner's concern actually demonstrates complex planning abilities, technical expertise, and sound financial management." She paused, looking directly at Michael and Sarah. "Adult children do not have the right to override their parents' life choices simply because they disagree with those choices or find them concerning. The evidence shows that Mr. Morrison is living independently, managing his affairs competently, and making decisions consistent with his values and preferences." The judge's gaze shifted to Hank. "However, Mr. Morrison, I encourage you to consider your children's concerns about emergency planning and social support. While you have the right to live independently, developing contingency plans for health emergencies and maintaining family relationships will serve you well as you age." Her final words were formal, but carried the weight of finality. "The petition for guardianship is denied. Mr. Morrison retains full legal capacity to manage his personal and financial affairs." The relief that flooded through Hank was so intense it left him momentarily dizzy. Jessica squeezed his arm in congratulation, but his attention was drawn to his children. Sarah was crying quietly, and Michael looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what had happened. Outside the courthouse, the three of them stood awkwardly in the parking lot. The legal battle was over, but the emotional aftermath remained unresolved. "Dad," Sarah said finally, "I want you to know that everything we did because we love you." "I know that," Hank replied. "But love doesn't give you the right to make decisions for me." Michael stepped forward, his corporate composure cracking slightly. "So what happens now? Do we just pretend this never happened?" "No," Hank said. "We figure out how to be a family again. But it starts with you accepting that I'm an adult who can make his own choices even if you don't agree with them." 3 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, Hank Morrison moved into his completed house. The moving truck looked small against the backdrop of desert and mountains, but it contained everything he needed: his furniture, Eleanor's piano, his tools, and a lifetime of accumulated possessions that would finally have a proper home. David Chen and Miguel Santos had volunteered to help with the move, along with several other contractors who had become friends during the construction process. As they carried boxes and furniture into the house, Hank felt a sense of completion that went beyond the physical structure. "Where do you want the piano, Mr. Morrison?" David asked, carefully maneuvering Eleanor's upright piano through the front door. "Living room, facing the mountains," Hank said. He hadn't played since Eleanor's death, but having the piano in his new home felt like keeping a promise to her memory. The day was filled with the satisfying chaos of settling in, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, connecting utilities, and discovering how the house felt as a home rather than a construction project. Every room worked exactly as he'd envisioned. Every detail served its intended purpose. As evening approached and the workers departed, Hank found himself alone in his completed house for the first time. He walked through each room, turning on lights and adjusting thermostats, claiming his space. In the kitchen, he made coffee and carried it to the covered patio, where he'd placed 2 chairs, one for himself and one for visitors. The desert stretched out before him, painted in the golden light of sunset. The familiar silhouette of the McDowell Mountains provided a sense of permanence and scale that reminded him of his place in the larger world. This view would greet him every morning and bid him good night every evening for whatever years remained to him. His phone rang. Sarah's number. "Dad, how was your first day in the house?" The question was simple, but the tone was different, less guarded, more genuinely curious. "Good," he said. "Really good. The house feels right. I'm glad. Listen, I know things have been difficult between us, but I was wondering, could the girls and I come see the house sometime, maybe this weekend?" The invitation surprised him. His granddaughters, now 16 and 14, had been casualties of the family tension. He'd missed too many birthdays and school events, too many opportunities to be the grandfather he'd always intended to be. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." "Great. And Dad?" "Michael wants to come too, if that's okay. He's been feeling terrible about everything that happened. That weekend brought an unusual December storm to the Phoenix area. Not snow, but a cold rain that drummed against the windows and transformed the desert landscape into something green and fresh. Hank spent the morning in his workshop, organizing tools and setting up his workbench. The space was exactly as he'd imagined it, efficient, well-lit, and designed for the kind of detailed work he loved. When his family arrived, they came bearing gifts: groceries for dinner, a bottle of wine, and a housewarming present wrapped in silver paper. His granddaughters, Emma and Sophie, seemed genuinely impressed by the house, especially the way it framed the mountain views and captured the desert light. "Grandpa, this is amazing," Emma said, running her hands along the kitchen countertops. "Did you really build all this yourself?" "I had help," Hank said, "but I designed it and managed the construction. Every decision was mine." Sophie was more interested in the technical aspects. "How did you know where to put the electrical outlets? How did you choose the colors? How long did it take?" For the next hour, Hank found himself giving an impromptu tour, explaining the design decisions and construction details that his granddaughters found fascinating. Sarah and Michael followed along, seeing the house with new eyes, not as evidence of their father's declining judgment, but as proof of his continued competence and creativity. "Dad," Michael said as they stood in the workshop, "I owe you an apology. I looked at this project and saw stubbornness and poor judgment. I should have seen vision and skill." "I was stubborn," Hank admitted, "but sometimes stubbornness is what it takes to build something that lasts." That evening, they cooked dinner together in the kitchen Hank had designed. Sarah proved surprisingly adept at using the professional-grade appliances, while the girls set the table in the dining area that overlooked the mountains. Michael, who rarely cooked, surprised everyone by preparing an excellent salad. As they sat around the table, sharing a meal in Hank's new home, the conversation gradually moved beyond the house itself to broader topics. The girls' school activities, Michael's work, Sarah's real estate business. For the first time in months, they felt like a family again, rather than adversaries in a legal battle. "Grandpa," Sophie said as they finished dessert, "will you teach me how to use the tools in your workshop? I want to build something." "What do you want to build?" "A bookshelf for my room. Mom says I have too many books, but I think the problem is not enough bookshelves." Hank laughed, recognizing his own practical approach to problem-solving. "I think we can manage that. We'll start with a simple design and work our way up to more complicated projects." As his family prepared to leave, Sarah pulled him aside for a private conversation. "Dad, I want you to know how sorry I am about the guardianship petition. I was so focused on worst-case scenarios that I couldn't see what you were actually accomplishing." "It's forgiven," Hank said. "But I need you to understand something. This house isn't just about having a place to live. It's about proving to myself that I still have something to offer, that my hands can still create something beautiful and lasting." "I understand that now. And Dad, Mom would have loved this house. She would have been so proud of what you've built." After they left, Hank sat alone on his covered patio, wrapped in a blanket against the unusual cold. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and crisp, and the stars were brilliant in the clear desert sky. The house around him was quiet and peaceful, filled with the potential for the life he would build within its walls. Over the next few months, that life began to take shape. Hank established routines that suited his temperament and energy levels. Morning coffee on the patio, workshop time in the afternoons, evening reading in the living room. He began accepting invitations to neighborhood potlucks and community events, gradually building a social network appropriate to his new circumstances. The workshop became a particular source of satisfaction. He built the bookshelf for Sophie, then a coffee table for Sarah, then a toy chest for Michael's family. Each project was an opportunity to exercise skills he'd developed over decades, to create something useful and beautiful with his own hands. His construction blog, which had documented the building process, evolved into a broader reflection on aging, independence, and the satisfaction of creating something lasting. His readership grew slowly but steadily, attracting other retirees facing similar decisions about how to structure their later years. One entry, written 6 months after moving in, captured his feelings about the choice he'd made. "People ask me if I'm lonely out here, if I miss the convenience of city living, if I worry about emergencies or health problems. The honest answer is that I sometimes feel isolated. I occasionally miss being able to walk to the grocery store, and I've thought carefully about medical emergencies and have plans in place. But what I've gained outweighs what I've given up. I've gained the satisfaction of living in a space I created with my own hands, according to my own vision. I've gained the peace that comes from being surrounded by desert and mountains instead of traffic and noise. I've gained the dignity of making my own choices about how to live my remaining years." Eleanor always said that a house becomes a home when it reflects the people who live in it. This house reflects who I am now, not who I was when I was married, Not who my children think I should be, but who I am at 68 years old, with my own ideas about what makes life worth living. The deed to this house has my name on it, but more importantly, every board, every nail, every carefully planned detail carries the mark of my hands and my decisions. When people ask me why I built this place, I tell them, because I could, because I wanted to, and because it's mine. As his first year in the house drew to a close, Hank Morrison found himself exactly where he'd hoped to be, living independently in a home he'd built himself, maintaining relationships with his family on his own terms, and facing the future with confidence rather than fear. The desert around his house changed with the seasons, green and blooming in spring, austere and beautiful in summer's heat, golden and peaceful in autumn's cooler days. Through all these changes, the house stood solid and permanent, a testament to the power of determination and the dignity of building something that would last. On quiet evenings, sitting on his covered patio and watching the sun set behind the mountains, Hank sometimes imagined Eleanor beside him, approving of what he'd accomplished. He'd kept his promise to build something lasting, something that reflected their shared values of craftsmanship and independence. The house was finished, but the life he was building within its walls continued to evolve and grow, and that, Hank reflected, was exactly as it should be.